My dad dragged me by the hair out of the house while I screamed, "I'm in labor." He shouted back, "Stop this pathetic attention-seeking act. You're embarrassing us in front of important people with your disgusting dramatics." My mom backed him up venomously, saying, "Your screaming is ruining your sister's engagement party to the mayor's son. We didn't raise you to be such a selfish disappointment. That bastard baby can wait until our real daughter's special moment is over." I didn't fight back. I didn't argue. I just quietly called 911, and their faces went white as I pressed. "I'm Sarah, and I need you to understand something before I tell this story. I was 20 years old, 37 weeks pregnant, and about to give birth on my parents' front lawn while 50 of the most influential people in our town watched from inside. But let me back up 6 months to explain how we got here. My parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, had always been obsessed with appearances. Dad owned the largest construction company in our mid-sized Pennsylvania town, and Mom ran a high-end catering business. They lived for charity galas, country club events, and anything that put them in the same room as politicians and business leaders. My older sister, Jessica, was their golden child, beautiful, smart, and engaged to David Wellington, the mayor's son, who was being groomed to take over his father's political career. Then there was me. I'd always been the disappointment. Not pretty enough, not ambitious enough, not interested in their social climbing. I worked part-time at a local bookstore and went to community college, which they considered beneath them. When I got pregnant by my boyfriend Marcus, a mechanic who came from the wrong side of town, they were mortified. "You've ruined everything," Mom hissed when I told them. "Do you have any idea what people will think? Jessica's engagement announcement is next month and you go and get knocked up by some grease monkey." Dad was worse. He called me a slut, said I was trying to destroy the family reputation, and demanded I either get an abortion or give the baby up for adoption and never speak of it again. When I refused both options, they made my life hell. They told everyone I was taking a gap year and tried to hide my pregnancy. I was forbidden from leaving the house when they had company, locked in my room during their dinner parties, and treated like a shameful secret. Marcus and I had planned to move in together after the baby was born. He was saving money and had found us a small apartment across town. My parents knew this and were counting down the days until I'd be out of their hair permanently. They'd already told their friends I was moving to California for college. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday in March. Jessica had been planning it for months with Mom's help, a lavish affair in our backyard with a tent, professional catering, and a guest list that read like a who's who of local politics and business. The mayor and his wife would be there along with city council members, the police chief, several judges, and the presidents of every major business in town. I was 37 weeks pregnant and had been having irregular contractions for 2 days. I'd mentioned this to Mom, but she'd waved me off, saying it was just Braxton Hicks contractions, and I was being dramatic. I wasn't allowed to see my doctor until after the party because they didn't want any complications ruining Jessica's big day. The morning of the party, I woke up at 4 a.m. with intense pain. By 6 a.m., the contractions were 8 minutes apart and getting stronger. I found Mom in the kitchen arranging flowers and told her I thought I was in labor. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "You are not doing this today. Take some Tylenol and stay in your room until this party is over. I will not let you ruin your sister's moment with your attention-seeking nonsense." "Mom, I'm not making this up. The baby is coming. The baby will come when I say it can come. Now get upstairs and stay there." By noon, guests were arriving, and I was in agony. The contractions were 4 minutes apart, and I could barely stand. I tried calling Marcus, but my parents had taken my phone. I knocked on Jessica's door to beg for help, but she just looked at me with disgust. "Could you be any more selfish?" she said. "This is the most important day of my life, and you're trying to make it about you. Just hold it in for a few more hours." Hold it in, like I was a child who needed to use the bathroom. By 3 p.m., I was doubled over in pain. I could hear the party in full swing downstairs. Laughter, clinking glasses, the mayor giving a speech about his wonderful future daughter-in-law. I tried to make it to the bathroom but collapsed in the hallway, screaming as another contraction hit. That's when Dad found me. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he bellowed, grabbing me by the hair and dragging me toward the stairs. "You're going to ruin everything." "I'm in labor," I screamed, but he wasn't listening. "Stop this pathetic attention-seeking act. You're embarrassing us in front of important people with your disgusting dramatics." Mom appeared at the top of the stairs, her face twisted with rage. "Your screaming is ruining your sister's engagement party to the mayor's son. We didn't raise you to be such a selfish disappointment. That bastard baby can wait until our real daughter's special moment is over." Dad dragged me down the stairs and toward the front door. I could see the shocked faces of guests through the window, people I'd known my whole life, watching my father manhandle his pregnant daughter. Some looked concerned, others just curious about the drama unfolding. He threw open the front door and literally tossed me onto the front porch. "Stay out here until you can behave yourself," he snarled. I lay there on the cold concrete, tears streaming down my face, another contraction ripping through me. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the emergency cell phone Marcus had given me weeks ago, an old phone with a prepaid plan I'd hidden from my parents. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" "I'm in labor," I gasped. "I'm giving birth on my parents' front porch, and they won't let me in the house." "Ma'am, what's your address?" I gave them the information, then added, "There's a party going on. About 50 people. My parents are hosting an engagement party, and they threw me out because I'm in labor. We're sending an ambulance and police immediately. Stay on the line." Through the front window, I could see my parents frantically talking to some guests, probably trying to explain away the disruption. Dad glanced outside and saw me on the phone. His face went white. He rushed outside. "Who are you calling?" I held up the phone so he could hear. 911 dispatch, are you still there?" "Yes, ma'am." "Help is 2 minutes away." Dad's face went from white to green. Mom appeared behind him along with Jessica and David. "Sarah, hang up that phone right now," Mom hissed. "Ma'am," the dispatcher's voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can you confirm that your parents physically removed you from the house while you were in active labor?" "Yes," I said clearly. "My father dragged me by the hair and threw me onto the front porch." The mayor himself had pushed to the front of the crowd. His face was a mask of horror as he processed what he was hearing. Judge Patricia Williams, the chief of police, and half the city council were standing right there, listening to every word. "And ma'am, is this during a social gathering?" "Yes, it's my sister's engagement party. There are about 50 people here, including the mayor and several city officials." That's when we heard the sirens. 1 ambulance, 2 police cars, and a fire truck came down our quiet residential street. The entire neighborhood came out to watch as paramedics rushed to help me while police officers began asking questions. "Sir, I need to speak with you about the circumstances here," Officer Martinez said to my father while paramedics checked my vitals. "This is a misunderstanding," Dad stammered. "She's being dramatic. This isn't what it looks like." "So, you didn't physically remove your pregnant daughter from the house?" Officer Martinez had his notepad out. The party guests were now spilling out onto the lawn, phones out, recording everything. I could see Mom trying to usher people back inside, but it was too late. The show had already started. "Sir, we need to get her to the hospital immediately," the lead paramedic announced. "She's in active labor. Probably has been for hours. This baby is coming soon." As they loaded me onto a stretcher, I heard Judge Williams speaking quietly to the mayor. "Robert, this is absolutely unconscionable. Throwing out a pregnant teenager during a medical emergency." "We should go," the mayor murmured to his wife. "David, we need to leave now." And just like that, the guests began an exodus. Within 10 minutes, the party my parents had spent months planning was over. The tent stood empty. Expensive catering going to waste while my family stood in the driveway being questioned by police. I gave birth to my daughter Emma 4 hours later. Marcus made it to the hospital just in time, and she was perfect. 7 pounds, 2 ounces of pure miracle. While I was holding my beautiful baby, my parents were at home dealing with the fallout. The story spread like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone in town knew what had happened. The local newspaper ran a front-page story: pregnant teen dragged from home during medical emergency. A photo of me being loaded into the ambulance with my parents standing in the background looking guilty accompanied the article. But the real damage came from social media. Someone at the party had recorded parts of the incident on their phone, including portions of the 911 call that could be heard from the open front door. The video went viral locally, then spread beyond our town. #JusticeForSarah started trending regionally, and my parents' business phone numbers became public information. The reviews started pouring in. Dad's construction company went from 4.5 stars to 1.2 stars overnight. Would you trust someone who throws his pregnant daughter onto the street to build your house? One review read. If he treats his own family like this, imagine how he treats his employees and customers. Mom's catering business was destroyed even faster. Absolutely disgusting people, read review after review. They literally threw their pregnant daughter out of the house during labor. Would never trust them with my food or my event. The mayor issued a public statement distancing himself from my family. David broke off his engagement with Jessica, saying he couldn't be associated with people who would treat a pregnant family member so cruelly. Jessica blamed me for ruining her life, but public opinion was not on her side. The local news picked up the story. Then the regional news. Within a week, we were getting calls from national outlets. My parents tried to do damage control, claiming they were just trying to get me to the hospital, and the whole thing was a misunderstanding, but the 911 recording made their lies obvious. Child Protective Services opened an investigation. The police filed charges for assault and endangering the welfare of a minor. I was still 19 and technically their dependent. The DA, who was at the party and witnessed everything, recused himself, but his assistant was eager to make an example of my parents. The business consequences were swift and devastating. Dad lost 3 major contracts within 2 weeks, including a $1 million city project. Apparently, politicians don't want to work with someone who's been charged with assaulting his pregnant daughter. Mom lost her biggest client, the country club, and several wedding bookings were cancelled. But I wasn't done. Marcus and I decided to pursue civil charges for medical negligence and emotional distress. My lawyer, who took the case pro bono after seeing the news coverage, argued that my parents' actions could have resulted in my death or Emma's death. We had medical records showing I'd been in labor for hours, expert testimony about the dangers of delaying medical care during childbirth, and video evidence of their actions. The lawsuit made even more headlines. During the depositions, my parents' true character came out. Mom testified that she thought I was faking it for attention despite having given birth to 2 children herself. Dad claimed he was trying to motivate me to handle my responsibilities better by throwing me out of the house. Their lawyer tried to argue that they were just trying to maintain order during an important social event, but that defense fell apart when my medical records were presented. I'd been having contractions for hours, my water had broken, and I was in active labor. Any reasonable person would have called an ambulance immediately. The civil trial lasted 2 weeks. Every day, the courtroom was packed with reporters and townspeople. My parents sat at the defendant's table, looking increasingly desperate as witness after witness testified about what they'd seen at the party. Judge Williams, who had been at the engagement party, recused herself, but the replacement judge was not sympathetic to my parents' case. He'd seen the viral videos, read the news coverage, and heard the 911 recording. When my parents' lawyer suggested that I had somehow orchestrated the whole thing for attention, the judge actually looked offended. "Counselor," he said, "are you suggesting that a 19-year-old girl faked active labor, complete with medical evidence and witness testimony, just to embarrass her parents at a party? That's not just unlikely, it's insulting to this court's intelligence." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found my parents liable for assault, negligence, emotional distress, and endangerment. The financial award was substantial, $350,000 in damages, plus coverage of all medical expenses and legal fees. But the money was just the beginning of their problems. Dad's business never recovered. He'd lost too many contracts, and his reputation was permanently damaged. Within 6 months, he was forced to declare bankruptcy and sell the company to a competitor for a fraction of its worth. Mom's catering business folded completely. No one wanted to hire the woman who had called her pregnant daughter's baby a bastard in front of half the town's elite. They had to sell the house to pay the legal judgment and their own attorney fees. The beautiful home where they'd hosted so many parties was bought by Marcus Boss, who paid cash and got it for 30% below market value because of the stigma attached to the property. Jessica never forgave them for ruining her engagement. She moved to another state and changed her last name, cutting off all contact. She blamed them for destroying her chance at the life she'd planned with David. And she wasn't wrong. My parents ended up renting a small apartment across town, both working retail jobs to make ends meet. Dad, who'd once employed 30 people and driven a BMW, was stocking shelves at a big box store. Mom, who'd catered events for senators and judges, was working a lunch shift at a chain restaurant. The social consequences were just as devastating. They were effectively blacklisted from every important social circle in town. Former friends crossed the street to avoid them. They were asked to leave the country club. Apparently, assaulting your pregnant daughter violates the membership code of conduct. The criminal charges resulted in guilty pleas and probation, plus mandatory anger management classes and community service. The judge made a point of noting that throwing a pregnant woman out of a house during a medical emergency was conduct unbecoming of any decent human being, let alone a parent. The civil lawsuit took place 8 months later, after the criminal case was resolved. But the fallout extended far beyond just my immediate family. The viral nature of the story had created ripple effects throughout our entire community that my parents never saw coming. David Wellington, Jessica's ex-fiancé, had initially tried to distance himself quietly from the scandal. But when reporters started asking him questions about his relationship with the family, he made the mistake of trying to defend them publicly. He gave an interview to the local news, saying that my parents were good people who made a mistake under pressure and that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion. The interview backfired spectacularly. Social media exploded with criticism of David for defending people who had endangered a pregnant woman's life. #DavidDefendsAbuse started trending locally, and people began questioning his judgment and character. The mayor's office was flooded with calls demanding that David be removed from his volunteer position on the city planning committee. His legal career, which had been carefully planned since childhood, suffered significantly. The law firm where he worked asked him to take a leave of absence when several clients expressed concern about his judgment. David's reputation in the local legal community was damaged, and within 6 months, he had left town entirely, moving to another state where he hoped to rebuild his reputation. Jessica, who had initially blamed me for ruining her engagement, began to realize that her ex-fiancé's downfall was entirely his own doing. She called me crying one night, apologizing for not supporting me and admitting that she'd been so focused on her perfect wedding that she'd lost sight of basic human decency. "I keep thinking about that day," she sobbed over the phone. "I actually told you to hold it in. I told my sister in labor to hold it in because I was worried about my party. What kind of person does that make me?" It was the first real conversation we'd had in years. And while I appreciated her apology, the damage to our relationship was profound. She'd chosen her social status over her sister's well-being, and that wasn't something that could be easily forgiven or forgotten. The story had also reached Marcus's family, who lived about an hour away. His parents, Maria and Tom Rodriguez, drove to the hospital the night Emma was born and were horrified when they heard what had happened. Maria, a nurse herself, was particularly outraged. "In all my years in healthcare," she told me while holding newborn Emma, "I have never heard of family treating a laboring woman this way. Sarah, you could have died. The baby could have died, and they were worried about a party." Marcus's family essentially adopted me from that point forward. They had been welcoming before, but after seeing how my own parents had treated me, they went out of their way to make sure I felt loved and supported. They helped with the baby, celebrated every milestone, and made it clear that they considered me their daughter in every way that mattered. The contrast between the two families became even more stark during the legal proceedings. While my parents hired expensive lawyers to try to minimize their culpability, Marcus's family attended every court date to support us. They helped with childcare when I had to give depositions, brought meals when I was too stressed to cook, and provided the emotional support that should have come from my own family. Meanwhile, the social media attention had attracted the interest of several advocacy groups. The National Organization for Women issued a statement condemning my parents' actions as an example of how women's health and autonomy are often dismissed or ignored. A pregnancy rights group used our story in their educational materials about the importance of supporting women during childbirth. I was invited to speak at several events about my experience, though I mostly declined. I wasn't ready to be a public figure, and I wanted to focus on my recovery and my new baby. But I did agree to one interview with Women's Health magazine, where I talked about the importance of taking pregnant women's concerns seriously and the long-term impact of family rejection during vulnerable times. The interview brought even more attention to the story, and with it came more consequences for my parents. Medical professionals in our area began sharing the story as an example of what not to do when a family member is in labor. A local hospital used it in their training materials for staff dealing with family conflicts during medical emergencies. Dr. Patricia Kim, the obstetrician who delivered Emma, was so disturbed by what had happened that she wrote an editorial for a medical journal about the importance of advocating for pregnant patients when family members are being obstructive. She didn't name us specifically, but she described the case in detail and used it to argue for stronger protocols to protect laboring women from family interference. Healthcare providers must be prepared to intervene when family dynamics threaten a patient's safety, she wrote. In this case, a young woman was physically removed from her home while in active labor and only survived without complications because she had the presence of mind to call for emergency assistance herself. The editorial was picked up by other medical publications and eventually reached a national audience. My parents, who had hoped the story would eventually fade away, found themselves being discussed in medical conferences and academic papers about patient advocacy and family dynamics during childbirth. The financial impact on their businesses continued to compound as well. Dad's construction company had been struggling even before the bankruptcy, but the loss of his commercial license was the final nail in the coffin. The state licensing board reviewed his case after the criminal conviction and determined that someone convicted of assault and endangering welfare posed a potential risk to public safety in construction work. He had to sell all his equipment at auction, and most of it went for far less than it was worth because everyone knew he was desperate. Mom's catering business had folded completely within 3 months of the incident. But the damage to her reputation extended beyond just lost clients. Other catering companies in the area refused to hire her as an employee, and several vendors she'd worked with for years cut ties with her entirely. The local food service community was tight-knit, and word traveled fast about people who couldn't be trusted. She eventually found work at a chain restaurant, but even that wasn't without complications. Some customers recognized her from the news coverage and would request different servers. The manager had to move her to kitchen duty to avoid confrontations, which paid less and was much more physically demanding than serving tables. The social ostracism was perhaps the most difficult part for them to handle. These were people who had built their entire identity around their position in the community, and suddenly they were pariahs. Former friends wouldn't return their calls. They were uninvited from events they'd attended for years. Even their church asked them to find another congregation after several members complained about their presence. I learned about much of this from other people in town. Not because I was seeking information about my parents, but because the story had become such a part of local lore that people assumed I knew everything that was happening to them. The pharmacist would mention seeing Dad looking terrible while picking up medication. The grocery store clerk would comment on how Mom had aged since the incident. It was like living in a small town where everyone knew the family scandal, except the family members themselves weren't talking to each other. About a year after Emma was born, I received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had been at the engagement party, came to my door with a casserole and an apology. "I've been thinking about that night for months," she said, tears in her eyes. "I saw what was happening, and I should have done something. I should have stood up to your parents, should have demanded they get you to a hospital. Instead, I just stood there watching like it was entertainment." She wasn't the only one. Over the course of that first year, several people who had been at the party reached out to apologize for their inaction. Some brought gifts for Emma. Others just wanted to express their regret about not intervening. It seemed like the whole town was processing the trauma of what they'd witnessed, and many people were struggling with their own complicity in what had happened. The mayor himself wrote me a formal letter of apology, expressing his regret that such an incident had occurred at an event he was attending and acknowledging that he should have done more to ensure I received immediate medical attention. He also announced that the city would be implementing new protocols for emergency services to ensure that domestic disputes involving medical emergencies would be handled more aggressively in the future. All of this attention and support made my recovery easier, but it also created a strange situation where my trauma had become a community reckoning. People were using my experience to examine their own behavior and values, which was probably healthy for the community, but sometimes felt overwhelming for me personally. Marcus and I decided to use some of the settlement money to move to a larger apartment in a different part of town, partly for privacy and partly because we wanted Emma to grow up somewhere that wasn't constantly associated with that traumatic day. We also started couples counseling to help us process everything that had happened and prepare for our future together. The therapist, Dr. Rachel Santos, was particularly helpful in explaining how trauma can affect family dynamics and helping me understand that my parents' behavior, while inexcusable, was part of a larger pattern of prioritizing appearances over authentic relationships. "Your parents built their entire identity around external validation," she explained during one session. "When you got pregnant, it forced them to confront the fact that they couldn't control everything in their family narrative. Instead of adapting and growing, they chose to reject the parts of reality that didn't fit their story. This understanding helped me process my anger and begin to heal, but it didn't make me any more interested in reconciling with them. Understanding why someone hurts you doesn't mean you have to let them continue hurting you." Meanwhile, Marcus and I used the settlement money to buy a house and start our lives together. Emma grew up knowing she was loved and wanted, surrounded by people who celebrated her existence instead of treating it as an embarrassment. The second year after Emma's birth brought even more unexpected developments. A documentary filmmaker named Jennifer Walsh reached out to me about featuring our story in a film she was making about maternal healthcare and family dysfunction. Initially, I wasn't interested, but after several conversations, I agreed to participate because I felt our story could help other women who were facing family rejection during pregnancy. The documentary, titled Labor of Love, When Family Fails, premiered at a film festival and won several awards. It featured interviews with me, Marcus, Emma's pediatrician, the paramedics who responded that day, and several witnesses from the party. My parents declined to participate, but their absence spoke volumes. The film brought national attention to our story and sparked conversations about reproductive health, family dynamics, and the importance of supporting pregnant women. I received hundreds of letters from women who had experienced similar rejection from their families, and many thanked me for sharing my story publicly. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a 17-year-old girl in Texas whose parents had kicked her out when they discovered she was pregnant. She wrote that seeing our story had given her the courage to call social services and seek help, and that she was now living with a foster family who supported her through her pregnancy. "Your story showed me that sometimes the family you choose is more important than the family you're born into," she wrote. "Thank you for proving that you can survive this and build a beautiful life." The documentary also had an unexpected impact on my parents. Several people told me that Dad had been seen crying in the movie theater when it played at our local cinema. Apparently, hearing the paramedics describe how dangerous the situation had been, and seeing the medical experts explain how easily Emma and I could have died, had finally made the reality of his actions sink in. But it was too late for regret to change anything. Around this time, I also learned that my parents had been seeing a marriage counselor, trying to save their relationship from the stress and blame that had consumed them since that day. According to Jessica, who had started calling me occasionally to check on Emma, the counseling sessions were explosive affairs where each parent blamed the other for the disaster that had befallen their family. Dad blamed Mom for pushing the idea that I was faking labor. Mom blamed Dad for physically dragging me out of the house. Neither seemed capable of taking full responsibility for their joint decision to prioritize appearances over their daughter's life. Jessica told me that during one particularly heated session, Mom had screamed at Dad that it was his idea to throw the engagement party in the first place and that if he hadn't been so obsessed with impressing the mayor, none of this would have happened. Dad had responded by saying that Mom was the one who insisted I stay hidden upstairs and who convinced him that I was just being dramatic for attention. The counselor had apparently told them that their relationship couldn't be salvaged until they both accepted responsibility for their actions instead of deflecting blame onto each other. Neither seemed capable of that level of introspection. For years later, I ran into Mom at the grocery store. She looked older, tired, wearing a uniform from the restaurant where she worked. She saw Emma in my shopping cart, and her face crumbled. "Sarah," she whispered. "Please, can we talk? Can I meet my granddaughter?" I looked at this woman who had called my child a bastard, who had stood by while her husband dragged me out of the house during labor, who had prioritized a party over her daughter's life. "Her name is Emma," I said quietly. "And no, you made your choice that day. You chose appearances over your daughter and granddaughter. Live with it." She started crying right there in the cereal aisle, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no regret, no desire to comfort her. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. "I've been going to therapy," she said desperately. "I understand now how wrong we were. I know we can't undo what happened, but please, I just want a chance to be a grandmother." "You had a chance to be a mother when I needed you most," I replied. "You chose not to take it. Emma deserves grandparents who would protect her, not people who would throw her out of the house during a medical emergency." I walked away and never looked back. But the encounter stayed with me for days. That night, Marcus found me crying in Emma's bedroom while she slept. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "No," I said firmly. "I'm just grieving the parents I thought I had." It's one thing to know intellectually that they prioritized appearances over everything else. It's another thing to see Mom standing there, finally understanding what she lost and knowing it's too late to fix it. He held me while I cried for the family that could have been, for the grandparents Emma would never know, for the 19-year-old girl who had needed her parents and been rejected instead. The next week, I found out through the community grapevine that my parents were getting divorced. Apparently, the grocery store encounter had triggered another massive fight, with Dad blaming Mom for making things worse by approaching me. Mom had finally had enough of being blamed for everything and filed for divorce. They sold their apartment and moved to separate towns about an hour apart. Dad went to live near his brother in Ohio, while Mom stayed local but moved to a smaller community where she hoped people wouldn't recognize her. Both were still working minimum wage jobs, still dealing with the financial and social consequences of their choices. The engagement party that was supposed to launch Jessica into high society ended up destroying my parents' entire world. All because they couldn't handle the idea of people knowing their daughter was pregnant outside of marriage. All because they prioritized their image over their child's safety. They lost everything: their business, their home, their social standing, their daughters, and their granddaughter. Jessica moved across the country and never spoke to them again. I built a beautiful life with Marcus and Emma, and they weren't part of it. Sometimes I wonder if they think it was worth it. If that party, those few hours of trying to impress people who forgot about them the moment the scandal broke, was worth losing their entire family. But then I remember the feeling of being dragged by my hair while in labor, the humiliation of giving birth on their front porch, the sound of my mother calling my unborn child a bastard, and I know they got exactly what they deserved. Emma is now 10 years old, smart and funny, and loved beyond measure. She knows her maternal grandparents exist, but understands that they made choices that hurt Mommy and her. so they're not part of our family. She has Marcus's parents, who adore her, and a life filled with people who would never dream of treating her the way my parents treated me. As for my parents, last I heard, they were still working their retail jobs, still living in that small apartment, still paying off the debts from their destroyed businesses. Dad's health isn't good. Stress and shame tend to age people quickly. Mom tried reaching out again on Emma's 7th birthday, but I didn't respond. They made their bed that March day when they chose their reputation over their daughter. They prioritized a party over a medical emergency, appearances over family, social climbing over basic human decency. The engagement party they thought was so important lasted about 4 hours before imploding spectacularly. The consequences of their choices will last the rest of their lives, and honestly, I sleep just fine with that. 7 years after Emma's birth, Marcus and I got married in a small ceremony surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported us. Emma was our flower girl, wearing a beautiful white dress that Maria Rodriguez had sewn for her. The wedding was everything my parents' social events never were: authentic, joyful, and focused on love rather than appearances. We invited the paramedics who had helped deliver Emma, Dr. Kim, who had taken such good care of us, and many of the neighbors who had supported us through the difficult early months. It was a celebration of the family we had chosen and built together rather than the one I had been born into. Jessica attended the wedding, having slowly rebuilt our relationship over the previous few years. She had moved back to our area after completing her master's degree and starting a career in social work, a choice she said was directly influenced by witnessing what had happened to me and wanting to help other families in crisis. "I think about that day all the time," she told me during the reception. "Not just what Mom and Dad did to you, but what I did. I was so caught up in my perfect party that I couldn't see my sister was having a medical emergency. It changed everything about how I see the world." She had never married David Wellington or anyone else, focusing instead on her career and personal growth. She was in therapy, working through her own issues with our family's dysfunction and her role in enabling our parents' behavior. While our relationship would never be the same as it was before that day, we had found a way to move forward as adults who understood each other's pain. During the wedding reception, I noticed several people taking photos and posting them on social media with captions about love, family, and new beginnings. The contrast with that disastrous engagement party 5 years earlier wasn't lost on anyone who remembered the story. The local newspaper even ran a small feature about our wedding, focusing on how we had built a beautiful life together despite the trauma we had endured. The headline read, "Love Conquers All, Local Couple Celebrates After Overcoming Family Tragedy." It was a completely different kind of publicity than what had surrounded us before: positive, hopeful, and focused on our resilience rather than our victimization. Meanwhile, my parents remained separated and estranged from both their daughters. Dad's health had continued to decline, and according to Jessica, who occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances, he was struggling with depression and had developed a drinking problem. Mom was still working at the restaurant but had reportedly become increasingly isolated and bitter. Sometimes people ask if I ever feel guilty about destroying my parents' lives. The answer is simple. I didn't destroy anything. I just called 911 during a medical emergency. Everything that happened after that was the natural consequence of their own actions. They dragged a pregnant woman out of the house during labor in front of 50 witnesses, including the town's most prominent citizens. They called their unborn granddaughter a bastard. They prioritized a party over their daughter's life. I just made sure everyone knew exactly who they really were. And that, in the end, was their real downfall. Not my phone call, not the lawsuit, not even the viral video. It was the simple fact that when faced with a choice between doing the right thing and maintaining appearances, they chose appearances. The people at that party saw my parents' true character that day. Everything else was just the inevitable result of that revelation. 8 years after Emma's birth, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a hospice social worker informing me that Dad was dying and had requested to see me and meet his granddaughter. He had pancreatic cancer and had only a few weeks left to live. Marcus and I discussed it extensively, and I ultimately decided to visit him, not for his sake, but because I wanted to look him in the eye one final time and make sure he understood exactly what he had lost. I found him in a small, sterile room in a hospice facility about an hour away. He looked nothing like the powerful, imposing man who had dragged me out of the house 6 years earlier. Cancer had ravaged his body, and the stress of losing everything had aged him far beyond his years. "Sarah," he whispered when he saw me. "You came." "I came to say goodbye," I said simply. "And to make sure you understand what you threw away." He started crying immediately. I know what I did. I thought about it every day for 6 years. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. Can you ever forgive me?" I stood there looking at this broken man, feeling nothing but pity. "No," I said quietly. "I can't forgive you. Not because I'm cruel, but because forgiveness requires accepting responsibility and making amends. You had 6 years to reach out, to try to make things right, and you chose not to until you were dying." I was ashamed, he sobbed. I didn't know how to fix what I had broken. "You could have started by admitting you were wrong and asking for help," I replied. "Instead, you chose to drink yourself into oblivion and blame everyone else for your problems." I showed him a photo of Emma on my phone. "This is your granddaughter. She's beautiful, smart, and loved. She knows she has maternal grandparents, but she also knows they made choices that hurt her mother. She doesn't ask about you because she has grandparents who actually love and support her." He stared at the photo with desperate hunger. "She looks like you did at that age." "She looks like herself," I corrected. "And she's going to grow up knowing that love means protecting people, not throwing them away when they become inconvenient." I spent about 20 minutes with him, mostly listening to his apologies and regrets. He told me about the therapy, the failed attempts at reconciliation with Mom, the business failures, and the slow descent into alcoholism and despair. It was a pathetic story, but I felt no satisfaction in his suffering, just a deep sadness for what could have been. "I lost everything," he said near the end of our conversation. "You gave everything away," I corrected. "There's a difference." He died 2 weeks later. Jessica called to let me know, and we discussed whether to attend the funeral. We ultimately decided to go, not to honor him, but to mark the end of that chapter of our lives. The funeral was small and sad. Mom was there, looking as broken as he had been. A few of his former employees attended, along with his brother and sister-in-law from Ohio. There were maybe 15 people total, a stark contrast to the hundreds who had attended events at our house when I was growing up. Mom approached me after the service. "I know you don't want to talk to me," she said quietly. "But I needed you to know that he regretted what happened every day until he died." We both did. "Regret isn't the same as redemption," I replied. "He had years to try to make things right. So did you. Instead, you both chose to wallow in self-pity and blame each other." "Is there any chance?" she started to ask, but I cut her off. "No," I said firmly. "There's no chance. You made your choice 6 years ago, and every day since then, you've chosen not to fight for your family. It's too late now." I walked away from the cemetery, knowing I would never see her again. She moved to Florida shortly after the funeral, apparently to live with a cousin who was willing to take her in. My parents often told me that actions have consequences. They just never expected their own actions to have consequences for them. They thought they were untouchable, that their money and social standing would protect them from accountability. They learned the hard way that dragging your pregnant daughter out of the house during labor tends to make people question your character, regardless of how much money you have or who you know. The last time someone mentioned them to me, they were working at different stores because they couldn't stand being around each other all day. Apparently, the stress of losing everything had taken a toll on their marriage, too. They blame each other for the disaster that unfolded that day, never quite able to admit that they both made the choice to prioritize appearances over their daughter's life. I built a beautiful life despite them, not because of them. Emma is thriving. Marcus and I are happy. And we're surrounded by people who actually care about us as human beings, not as accessories to their social ambitions. The revenge wasn't planned, wasn't calculated. It was just the natural consequence of their choices colliding with reality. They wanted to keep up appearances, and I simply made sure everyone could see who they really were behind those appearances. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people reveal their true character and facing the consequences of their actions. In my parents' case, those consequences happened to be losing absolutely everything they cared about. And the most beautiful part? They did it all to themselves. I just made the phone call.